Have you ever wondered how photographers and videographers can get the perfect lighted image for their uses? Basically, this whole concept is called the exposure triangle. And in this video I'm going to explain to you the exposure triangle, how to use it, what it contains and how to use it in real life. What is the exposure triangle? The exposure triangle is a relationship between three elements in photography. Those elements include ISO, aperture and shutter speed. On top we have the aperture, on the right left there is the shutter speed, and over here we have the ISO or ISO. By the way, ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Just a little fun fact. Let's start with the aperture. Imagine your camera lens as an eye. The aperture is the pupil of the eye controlling how much light enters the camera. We measure aperture in f-stops. Here's the tricky part. The smaller the f number, the larger the aperture is opening. So my explanation of this is, if this is the lens and the aperture amount is the distance between the outer rim of the lens and the aperture, means the f-stop counts the distance between the border and the aperture opening. The smaller the distance between the border and the aperture opening is, the more light can go into the camera. An aperture of f1.8 gives you a shallow depth of field, perfect for portrait photos if you want a blurry background. On the other hand, f16 lets in less light but gives you a wider depth of field, great for a landscape where you want everything in focus. Next up is shutter speed. This is how long your camera's shutter stays open, allowing light to hit the sensor. We measure it in fractions of seconds, like 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 30. Fast shutter speeds like 1 to 1,000 capture action. Think sport photography or an air show. You can use a low shutter speed like 1 for 30 for things like panning shots, or you can use a very long shutter speed like 15 seconds. This is optimal for long exposure shots like this one. Long exposure shots. But keep in mind, when you use such long shutter speeds, please use a self-timer on your camera or an external shutter, because the vibration when you press the button can lead to a blurry image, and if you don't want a blurry image, you should use a self-timer. The last thing we're covering is ISO. This is the sensor's sensitivity to light. Lower ISO numbers like 100 or 200 are less sensitive to light and produce cleaner images. Higher ISOs like 3200 or 6400 are more sensitive to light but can introduce more to your image. When you have a very high shutter speed in sports photography, then there is less light which comes to your sensor. And if you are in an air show, you also need a great depth of field, which means you cannot use a f-stop like 1.8, so you have to increase your ISO to about 800 so that your sensor is more sensitive to light, but this results in more noise and can produce grainy images. ISO is also very helpful if you are in a night location and you have your maximum aperture opening and your lowest shutter speed you can go without blurring the image. Then you can also increase your ISO to 3200. If you understand those three key elements of the exposure triangle, then there's literally nothing in lighting which can stop you from your creativity and quality in images. You can use a small aperture for very bokeh background, this blurry background you know in portraits, but you can also capture fast moving objects like a jet or a bird in nature with a high shutter speed. You are ready for night locations because you know how to use the ISO of your camera. Conclusion. Just for summary, we have those three elements of light coming to your sensor. This is aperture, your shutter, speed, how much light goes on your sensor, but how sensitive your sensor is to the light, but it's also a part of the exposure triangle. The aperture is how wide open, wide or close, how much wide open or close is your shutter speed, defines fastness of your shutter. And the ISO is how sensitive is your sensor to the light. So now it's your turn. Grab your camera, play with these settings and see how they affect your images. If you like this video, please consider to subscribe. And if you don't know who I am, check out this video over there somewhere.